Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the only skill I would keep if I could only keep one. And that skill takes care about managing my project's memory. So why would that be the only skill I keep? Very, very simple. That's literally the only skill that is always installed for all my projects. And the reason is simple is because it doesn't matter if I'm doing legal projects, accounting projects, technical projects, marketing projects, I always need to manage my memory. Because if you don't manage your memory, then the system or the AI system loses track of things, start to hallucinate, and so on and so forth. But there are mainly three types of problem that memory solve. Number one is amnesia and hallucination. I mean, this one is obvious, no memory, and it doesn't remember what you've been working on yesterday. Number two is context management. You have, at least as far as we are at the moment, 2026, we only have 1 million token, which seems a lot, but actually can go away very quickly. And therefore, we want to be able to manage our memory in a very efficient way. Number three is quality, of course. Because if we don't have memory, we also risk to create the wrong thing or create the right feature, but a feature that would probably break another feature, or implement a fix that actually fixed the problem but create 3 other problems. So these are the 3 things: is amnesia, context window, and quality. So that's why we need memory. Now, before we jump into how this skill works and what it does and how it does it, I want to talk about 2 things. Number 1 is that if you're about to abandon me right now, if you're about to click away from this video, there's only one thing I want you to do before you leave. It's not to subscribe, though you can subscribe, is the concept of progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure is a super important design pattern that I want you to remember, because my solution, as well as many other solutions, depend on this design pattern called progressive disclosure. What is progressive disclosure? And even if you want to leave this video after this, that's it. It's fine by me, because this is literally the most important thing I want you to take away from this video. Progressive disclosure is the ability for an LLM to only load the information it needs to do its work. So imagine you have a huge piece of documentation or a lot of information. If your LLM is capable to break it down in small bits and only load the pieces it needs, then it's great. Because at that point, you're not bloating the context window. You're only loading what you need when you need it. And that's progressive disclosure. And progressive disclosure, as you probably understand, will be part of the solution I'm going to introduce soon. But it's not just for memory. Skills, the way skills are being loaded, whether it's in Claude, Codex, Cursor, and all the others, use progressive disclosure. So when you say, I want you to do this, if do this triggers a skill, that means that at that point, the skill was not in memory yet. What was in memory was the name of the skill and a description of the skill. And because this was in memory, because Claude loads that ahead of time, then when you say, I want to do this, if there's a skill that knows how to do this, at that point, that's when Claude will load the content of your skill in its context window. And so Claude uses progressive disclosure for a lot of activities. And you don't even see it, but this is how it does it behind the scene. And that's very important, because this is how you keep your context window small or lean. And this is quite important, because if you do a lot of work, then you'll save a lot of money. And also, not just money, but as your context window gets smaller and smaller, the quality of the answer of the LLM also starts to decrease. So that's why you really want to be able to do all your work as quickly as possible with the minimum amount of token, and then stop your session and create a new one. Because if you keep going, then the quality will drop. Anyway, so this is it. If you're bored with this video, you can just turn it off. But please subscribe before, that'd be great. Now, what are the other solutions on the market that you may be familiar with that I still think suck? And there are mainly 2, in my opinion. One that I see with my clients a lot, and the other one that is already implemented in other very popular systems. The one that typically you're familiar with is with system like Hermes or OpenClaw. And how the system works is there is a background agent or a background process on your computer that kind of listen to everything you're talking about between you and your agent, whether it's Hermes or OpenClaw. And they automatically decide for you, that's an interesting piece of information, I'm going to store it on the computer. And what's good about the solution is that they're automatic, which is also what I think they're bad, because you actually have no clue what they decide to keep in memory and what they don't decide, and what they decide to send to the garbage. So in my opinion, I prefer to be in charge of my memories, but it's a question of, it's a preference. The other reason why I think those systems sucks is because what they are is they're not projects memory, they're users memory. Meaning that my memory might not be your memory. Now, if we're collaborating on a project, I don't really care about your memory, and you don't really care about my memory. What we really care is the memory that is relevant to projects, and that means that the memory has to stay with the project, not with the computer where the project was created. And I think that's the biggest flaw with systems, memory systems like Hermes or OpenClaw, or more generally, those systems pioneered by Andrej Karpathy through his design pattern called LLM Wiki. LLM Wiki works that way. It's a process that listens to you and can just automatically update your memory on your computer, whether it's on Obsidian or on GitHub or whatever. But again, this is your memory, not the project's memory, and I think that's why they suck, at least when it comes to project's memory. So that's the first pattern. The second pattern is something that I see a lot with my clients, and I'll show you that right now. Imagine we have this fake project here. The source code is inside here. And what my clients do often is that they have this Claude.md that I also personally don't really like. That's for another video. So if you want to see why I don't like the Claude.md or the agents.md, they're the same, except that Claude is for Anthropic, agents.md is for the others. Anthropic, when are you going to just stick to the standard? And they store their documentation, which is their memory, inside this gigantic README file. So now they have this huge README file. It's massive. The good thing is that the README file contains everything about the project, which is great. And they also do this weird thing, which is they store the changes in a log.md. So every time they make a change to the project, they put a detail of the change or changelog inside that file. And there's absolutely no problem with doing this. It's actually, I do that. That's for another video about release management. So if you want to know more about release management, super, super important, please consider subscribing because this is coming soon. But that's what they do. They just put all the changes to their project, whether they've deleted something, updated something, or created something, that goes there with a date stamp. And the issue with this is that this becomes even bigger than the README file. It becomes over months and years of project development. This becomes massive. And so what's the good, the bad, and the ugly? Well, the good thing at least is that the memory is inside the project. So when you save that project, whether you save it on GitHub or on GitLab or you zip it and you share it with your friends or your colleagues, the good thing is that they have access to that memory. So that's great. So problem number one, amnesia, is solved. Problem number three is also solved. The problem number three was the quality, because we have the memory now, the quality should be good. I mean, somehow. You'll see why in a second. But the problem number two, which is bloating the context window, it's not fixed. On the contrary, now you get those ridiculously large files that you have to load in memory up front. When you start a new session, you load all the documentation. And now you've already burned a lot of your context window. So this is why it's also not great, because you're burning your context window faster. And if those files are ridiculously large, then potentially you're burning a lot of your context window. Then obviously the quality of your answers are also going to be bad. They're not going to be as good as if you were starting on a very lean context window. And the worst offender is this log.md. this is the worst offender because typically what my clients do, it is actually possible that the log.md is so big that it simply doesn't even fit in the context window, or the system refuses to put it there. So typically what my clients do, they truncate it and only take the last 1,000 lines. But again, what if there's very important pieces of information in the tail of that log.md? So that's fucked up. Also, why 1,000 line? Like, why not 500? Why not 2,000? That's also arbitrary. So this is a system that doesn't really work. But the good thing, though, is that the memory is somewhere and we can access it. So I'm pretty sure that by now you must have guessed what is the good system, because I'm telling you this system is not that bad, because at least it's in the project. And I told you that if there's only one thing I want you to remember in this video is the concept of progressive disclosure. So what we need is this system, but with progressive disclosure. And this is exactly what the skill I'm going to introduce you in a second does. But before this, a word of our sponsor, which is myself. I have created a project called happyskills.ai that manages skills for you. Happyskills.ai is a registry of skills where you can find all the latest skills from all the biggest players without leaving Claude. So how does that work? In your Claude or in your Codex, you simply say something like this. You say, use HappySkills to find all the skills necessary to build a legal project that focuses on intellectual properties, and also find skills to build a web app that is responsive and that I can also install on mobile. So here, what's going to happen is that instead of having to know where the skills are and figuring out like what skill exists, HappySkills will take your query and literally understand what you mean and will search for the right skill for you. And it'll present a list of candidates, and it's up to you to decide which skills you want to install. You might as well also install all of them if you want. So here we go. So it has found, for the legal, it has found all those skills here. For the PWA, so the progressive web app, it has found all those skills here. They're ordered by quality, and also HappySkill looks at their descriptions to make sure that they match what you want. And here is the skill for the responsive UI, and that's it. You decide which one you want to install, and here you go. That's the first thing that HappySkills does. The second thing that HappySkills does, it really helps you to create skills. There is a skill shipped out of the box with Claude that sucks. That's the skill creator, and it'll create a skill for you, but the average. And there is way more than meet the eyes with skills, and HappySkills will be the best way to create skills for you. Cherry on the top, you can host your web skills on HappySkills privately, meaning that now you don't have to worry about making it public. You don't have to be familiar with GitHub and all this stuff. You simply create an account completely free on HappySkills. You publish a skill there privately. You can create a workspace. You can invite all your colleagues to the workspace and start to share all your skills there. So no need of having a cryptic GitHub that is not discoverable. Once your skill is published on HappySkills, you simply can search it the way I've just asked the system to search it. You can search it by name. You can just make a descriptions and so on and so forth. And also the great thing is that if they're all private and under a private workspace, then if you have all your colleagues under that workspace, and your workspace can say, hey, I need a skill to do release management for my APIs, or I need a skill to design APIs using our own conventions in the company. And that's it. You'll find the skills there and you can install them. Also, they're completely versioned, so you don't have to worry about this either. So you have a skill, you update the skill directly in your project, you republish it, it'll fix automatically all the conflicts, version it, and you can always go back to the previous version if you want. So this is how it works. It's completely free. So how do you install HappySkills? That's simple. You open Claude or Codex, and you simply type go to install.happyskills.ai and install it. That's it. Again, the spirit here with HappySkills is that you can do everything from your Claude or your Codex. And here I'm using the CLI, but you can use your desktop, like Claude Desktop or Codex. Don't use Claude Cowork. Claude Cowork is a mess. I'll do another video about this. You use Claude Code inside the Claude Desktop, same thing for Codex. And then simply type, just prompt this. So just prompt this and it'll install the skills globally on your computer. And that's it. Once Happy Skills is installed on your computer, then you're good to go. You can use it to install, discover, publish skills, and there's way more coming soon. So stay tuned. Now let's go back to where we were before. So now the solution to the memory. Well, the solution is a skill called project memory. And under project memory is called a skills constellation. A skills constellation is a skill that has a lot of other skills as dependencies. And again, this concept of skills constellation is something very specific to Happy Skills. So we have multiple skills here. We have init context, which is the skill that you're always going to have to start with when you start a new session. We have init-doc, which is the skill that is going to create the documentation for you without you lifting a finger. We'll cover that in a second. We have update-doc, which is at the end of your session, when you're done, you run that skill to help you update your documentation. And then we have refactor-doc, when some of your documentation have gone too big, and we have to split them to make them lean. So the progressive disclosure works its magic, and we never burn too much context window. So before I do the demo with those skills, let's just quickly have a look at what it looks like on a complicated project. Here is a complicated project. I mean, that's my pet project called bobninja.com. Bobninja is just a series of little tools. And the idea with Bob Ninja is that I can practice all my agentic programming skills with it. 100% of Bob Ninja was done using AI. And the idea here is that there's no server. It's just purely static websites, static apps. Everything works in the browser thanks to, so now WebAssembly is quite amazing. For example, here we get compressed PDF, and compressed PDF allows you to compress a PDF directly in the browser with Rust compiled to WASM. No server. So whereas other compressed PDF solutions, you send your PDF to the server compresses it and returns it to you. So here it's completely private. It's completely, because it never leaves your computer, and it's completely free. So this is Bob Ninja, but this is a monorepo. So a monorepo is a large project with many subfolders. And obviously, so the projects are all here, apps, tools, and that's it. And those apps can be quite complicated, like the compressed PDF, like there's also like a Rust code. Compressing PDF was actually a complete pain in the neck, and there are actually plenty of bugs in this source code. So how does the documentation, how does the memory works? And the memory is actually very similar to this guy here. It's pretty much just documentation. But how does the documentation structured? The documentation is structured with a README file that is very lean. It's less than 300 lines. And that README just introduces the project, gives a high-level overview of the project. It's never meant to be more than 500 lines. And it cross-links. So here we have a documentation section. It cross-links to many other smaller pieces of documentation that are all very specialized. And this is under this docs folder. Now, under this docs folder, you will have like things like architecture, you have things like fonts, gotchas, SEO, and so on and so forth. It really depends on what you're doing, all right? But there's always a gotchas here, which is an entry point to cross-linking to other documents that are under the gotchas folder. So every time, and gotchas are super important. Sometimes even the most important part of the documentation is the gotchas, because very often LLMs, especially as they're getting smarter, they know like how to create websites, they know how to use React and so on and so forth. But there are gotchas sometimes that are very specific to your project. So gotchas are actually sometimes very important piece of information that you've learned by going in the trenches with your AI assistant and that you definitely want to document because you don't want to make the same mistakes over and over again. So gushes are very, very important. And finally, we have this weird little file here called the doc manifest. And the doc manifest is just a large JSON file that lists all the files in your system. It works almost like a mini graph database. A graph database is just like a series of nodes. So here, each file is a node and the relationship that all the nodes have together. And that really helps. It's very helpful to understand where pieces of logics are. So you could have, like, for example, authentication could be split between different files, especially if you're using a monorepo. And at that point, for authentication, you look like all the files that are associated with the authentication process. Now, don't be afraid because this file can be very large, but don't have to be worried about this because it's never completely loaded in the context window once. And I'll explain that in a minute. So how does this work? Well, now, when you start a new session, what you do, you always use this skill and you start with init context. And here I'm going to take a query that I've rehearsed for this demo. This is a real legit query where a user is reporting that the compressed PDF is crashing the browser on mobile, which is legit. It's exactly what happens when the PDF is too large. So here, when the PDF is like a few hundred megabytes or 100 megabytes, it will crash your mobile browser. So what init context does is that it takes your requests as input, and that could be a new feature, a fix, or simply a question, something like, what database do we use for this project? Something like that. And what it does, it uses your request to then decide. It will always, init context will always read the README, which is very lean because the README is supposed to be very, very small. So at that point, the LLM have enough context to understand what this project is all about. It will always read the gotchas entry point, which is also very lean because this is actually just a cross-link to other gotchas files, and each gotchas file has a description. And now that it knows this, based on your query, it'll know which piece of documentation it has to load to get enough context to help you with your request. And also based on this, it'll use a little piece of Python to the information it needs from the doc manifest. And that way, the doc manifest is not completely loaded in the context window, only small part of it are being loaded in the context window to know exactly where files are. And that's it. So that's how you get started. And there's another part of the skill that says, hey, at the moment, we only need those X number of files. But as our conversation progresses, we may need to load more files. So the skill also takes care of this and set the AI for success in terms of saying, hey, remember that we have documentation. If we change direction and we go work on a different problem, or we discover something more complicated, then don't forget that you need to keep loading documentation as we go, if that helps. And it knows how to do this because there is a piece of explanation on each file about what each file does. So here's the answer to our query. And I'm not going to go through this because this is not the point of this video. But what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to ask it, how many pieces of documentation is there in this project? And how many did you just load in your context window to answer that question? And if everything worked like I described, it should not have loaded. It should have loaded just the right amount of documentation. Remember that we're working on this mini app called compressed PDF, and then we have a memory problem with that app. Awesome. So we have apparently 47 pieces of documentations, and it only read 6 of them. Excellent. Obviously, like I said, it read the README because it has to. It read the gotchas because it has to. Like, no matter what, it will read those 2. But then, based on the nature of our specific problem, it loaded those 4 extra pieces of documentation. And it's great because you can all see that they are related to the compressed PDF. And like I said, we have many other apps, but all the documentation that was loaded in the context was all related to this guy here. So it did this job. Excellent. We're very happy with this. Now you understand where I'm going here. I think you understand exactly how this thing works. Now, next question is, well, Nick, how the hell do I create this amazing piece of documentation? Well, you don't have to worry about this. There's another skill. So you install, and I'll explain to you how to install those set of skills in a second. But once you have them, you take your project and you simply run init-doc. And that's it. You run that skill, and what this skill will do, it'll start by reading your existing documentation if it finds any, but it will not use it. It will not necessarily believe it. It'll take it just as a way to get some context about your project. What it'll do after that, it'll reverse engineer all your source code to really understand what's going on there. And it'll do that multiple times just to make sure that it gets it that right. And then when it has this, it'll create the documentation for you. So it's not a quick process. It'll take time, but it's worth it because it's quite important. And it'll create, like I said, the README file. It'll create the manifest JSON with the graph of all your files. It'll create the docs folder. And it'll also create the gotchas and so on and so forth. And it will be the one deciding how to break down the documentation in different topics based on what you already have in your project. So that's it. That's how you initialize your documentation. The old documentation won't be thrown away. It'll be put into a hidden folder as a backup. Once that's done, then that's how it compares the new documentation with the old one to make sure that we haven't missed anything. But after that, it's up to you to decide if you want to throw that old documentation to the bin or keep it. Up to you. Now you have a new beautiful piece of documentation that works with those skills to do progressive disclosure, and you pretty much have memory in your project. Hallelujah. But how do you update it? So this is your responsibility. And this is where here, this is a very opinionated view of documentation and memory. For me, memory is so critical for project and so important that I don't want to delegate that to an AI, especially that I'm actually not the one documenting anything. I'm just the one initiating the process of documenting. So at the end of the session, or whenever I want during the session, if I think that there's something very important that has happened, then I'll simply type update doc. And what you can do with update doc, you can just simply execute the skill, and what it'll do is that it'll take all the information in the existing session, and then it'll compare that to the existing documentation, and it'll decide if there's anything worth documenting. Because if you're working on a stupid bug, like for example, the button is not spinning when you click on submit, this is maybe not worth documenting. So at that point, the skill say, well, this is just a bug. This is not very important. It'll literally come back to you and say, I'm not going to document that. This is not worthy. You can say, no, I really want that to be documented, and say, okay, cool, I'll do that for you, but whatever. So it'll decide what to document and how to document it and where to document it. So you don't have to worry about it. If you have a very strong opinion on how things should be documented, for example, you may think that the thing that you've done in your session is so critical, it's so new that you want to make sure that a dedicated file is created just for that topic. Then you may say, for example, let's imagine that it's about deploying, like you've never automated the deployment of your app in the cloud. Then you want, and you've done that in that session. So you want to make sure that there's a deployment.md inside your docs folder. So you could say, just learn how to deploy this web app in the cloud. I want this to be fully documented, but I don't want that to exist I don't want that to be documented inside an existing file. I want to make sure that we have a dedicated deployment.md file under the docs folder. So here, the update docs skill supports like input, where you can just steer the way the documentation is going to be updated. So that's for update doc. And then once in a while, At the end of that process, after updating the doc, it is possible that the skills come back to you saying, hey, I've done all my work. However, some of the files that I've changed are now getting too big. And we recommend that you refactor this. Because again, if a piece of documentation becomes too large, then we're losing the benefit of progressive disclosure. So at that point, we have to split it or rewrite it. And for that, we have the skill, refactor-docs. You can simply run it that way. It'll audit all the documentation, see which one is too big, and the goal is simply split files and trying to reorganize the content to keep things quite small. And that's it. These are all the main skills. Now, there are other skills, like this one here, init mission. And I'll talk about this in another video, because this is not really related to managing memory. It is related to setting up your agent for success. So at that point, please subscribe to this channel if you want to learn more about this, but this is a bit outside of the scope of this video. But I'll do a video about this very, very soon. Obviously, now the next question you have is, Nick, how the hell do I get those skills on my projects? And it's very, very easy. You use Happy Skills. So this set of skills is hosted on Happy Skills. And if you don't have Happy Skills installed on your computer, it's very simple. You do go to install Happy Skills.ai and install it. And you just run this prompt. And what this thing will do is that it will install Happy Skills globally on your computer as a global skill. And once Happy Skill is installed, then you can simply use Happy Skills to install that skill. So I'll do that in a new project, because our project memory is already installed on this project. Yeah. For a new demo 7. All right, so here is an empty project called demo 7. There's nothing there, and I'm going to simply say, use Happy Skills to install the skill called project memory. Now, project memory is what I refer as a skills constellation. What is a skills constellation? Skills constellation is a skill that is broken down in multiple skills. So here, in our case, project memory is a skill. And under it, it has many dependencies. One of them is init context. The other one is init-doc, update-doc, and so on and so forth. This is something that is very specific to the way Happy Skills is designed. On Happy Skills, you can obviously host standard skills, but in my experience, what tends to happen is that you start building a skill, and that skill becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The problem with a skill that becomes bigger and bigger and bigger is that at some point, when it can do everything, it's not being auto-triggered or auto-invoked automatically, because it does so many things that the AI gets very confused on when to call it. And if you have many skills that are too large, that are just, you've installed like plenty of skills, and you're saying, release my app, then there'll be so many skills that can do that. Then it won't know exactly what skill to use. So that's why when your skill becomes too big, it's better to split it. But if you split your skill in multiple skills, the issue is that your user experience becomes shit, because now you need to explain to your users how to install 1,000 skills. With a constellation, in my case, this skill is called project memory. Like I've just said, you simply install project memory, and project memory will come with all these dependencies. That's it. And you can simply say also, like, if there's a latest version, you can simply say update project memory to its latest version. At that point, not only will update project memory, but it will also update all its dependencies. So here, the search has figured out that on Happy Skills, we have more than one skill called project memory. And nicolasdao, the creator of Happy Skill. So this is the first one. So you can choose this one. And that's it. Project memory is installed locally on your project. And if you wanted to install that globally, then you could have said install it globally. As simple as that. And that's it. This covers how to use project memory. I hope you found that super useful. I hope, like I said, the most important thing is that you understand how progressive disclosure works. So you can also build skills that leverage progressive disclosure. And therefore, you maximizes your usage of tokens. In an upcoming video, I will talk about how to create amazing specifications, and I have a specific skills for that. And the reason this is a good segue to this video is because specification in a way is also part of your memory. And I haven't talked about that in this video because it's not technically part of your memory, but it's very, very useful as you progressing in your project that you actually create specifications and you keep those specifications somewhere safe. That way, 1 year down the track, when something weird happens, whether it's a bug or a new feature or something like this, you may say, oh man, like I forgot why we did this, or I forgot what drove those decisions. And then you can go back in your history of specifications, and often there are gems there that the LLM will love using to reason about why you did the things you did. Because trust me, when you start to work in parallel and you start to work on a lot of different projects, which is what agentic programming allows you to do, then you tend to very quickly forget why you did the things you did. So specifications, they're also an amazing way to work in parallel. And that doesn't sound obvious now, but that's why you need to subscribe to my channel, because when I talk about this, it'll become crystal clear. So that's it. I hope you find that very useful. And with that said, I'll catch up with you in the next one. Cheers.